I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm talking about the movie In the Blink of an Eye, being joined by director Andrew Stanton and writer Colby Day. And, Colby, in starting with you, I've heard you describe how one of the things that you love about science fiction is the way that it allows for a lot of self-examination of humanity and the idea of exploring human behavior. And so I wanted to ask about the way in which you really wanted to utilize that to ask a lot of questions within your characters within this film.
Yeah, I love getting to tell big stories on big canvases because I think it then lets you really dig into, well, what is it about us that makes us human, given we have this crazy world we live in? And so, part of telling a story about the past, present, and future and our place in it was sort of trying to alleviate my own existential fears of how will I be remembered? What will my impact be? And I think, getting to play with characters and get to know them in small, intimate little moments within a big canvas is always really what's most fascinating to me.
No, I love that. And Andrew, for you in coming in and directing this script, it's so expansive in terms of it's not just approaching three stories within the overall arch of a narrative feature, but it's the amount of time that passes within each of these stories as
Yeah.
well. And so I was just curious kind of how you set about breaking that into more incremental pieces that felt manageable for you and figuring out your approach as a director.
Well, he had yeah, Colby had done most of the heavy lifting and proving that. What I loved was how effective it was even on the page that I was receiving it through all the intimate moments. There's that John Lennon quote, "Life is what happens while you're busy making other plans." And you live long enough, you realize that's really your life, is those moments, for as much as there's the events that you plan for or don't plan for. And somehow he captured the summation of that, and I just wanted to honor that. I felt it gave a fresh perspective on something that we always existentially think about, which is what Colby was saying, what's our impact, and how is my place in all this. But I just love that it made me see the humanity in any person at any time in the spectrum of humanity, and somehow it just did that. And that's what I loved about it. It was just the constant interweaving of that.
No, it's wonderful. And, Colby, with what Andrew was just describing about the quote about life being the things that happens while you're making other plans, was that something that you were consciously thinking about in terms of writing the script and just finding those little moments in between, those little heartbeats that kind of really form the characters and form the story?
Yeah, I think so much of what I wanted to talk about in the film was the idea that you cannot really make plans effectively, that the world will go on with or without you, and so much intrudes upon what you think you're going to go do, and so much of being a person is just sort of trying to weather the storm and find a little band of people who want to do that with you. So yeah, I didn't have John Lennon's quote in mind, but absolutely. I mean, it's all the same idea for sure.
But what I loved about it was like the imperfectness of it. Like life is imperfect, and their arches of their stories weren't perfect either, and they didn't match a line perfectly, but they were the same glossary. Like eventually, over the course of every one of those three stories, they hit upon the same moments that we all will as humans, no matter what our place in life is and our timeline is, and that's the thing that's universal. And it was sort of somehow capturing the juxtaposition of that imperfectness in all three stories that was, I thought, so challenging and fascinating.
Yeah. And even one of the things that's kind of an example of those small moments is the relationship that we see on screen with Rashida Jones's character Claire and David Diggs's character Greg, because they spend a lot of the beginning of when they meet physically separated while she's home taking care of her mom and dealing with her passing. And yet that still shows the connectivity and the magnetism and the foundation of what then becomes their relationship moving
Yeah.
forward. And so how did you feel like that was just as important when it's obstacles and they're not even physically in the same space and it is those little interconnected moments?
I
I
think
thought it
so
was
much. Oh, so go
go,
ahead.
go no go, go no go ahead, Colby.
I think so much of being alive today is about trying to connect and trying to find a way to hold on to each other, especially
Yeah,
when so much noise around us. And so it just felt true to me that
yeah.
you would begin a relationship sort of bombarded by the world around you and have to try to find a way to reach out to one another.
Yeah, I think it's more representative of relationships now and has been for a while.
And in directing those scenes, Andrew, how did you kind of approach the idea that you obviously need to build for the audience the idea of this chemistry and this foundation of a relationship forming, but you have your two actors physically separate in different places and kind of using technology in a way that feels connected?
Well, it was sometimes it was as simple as treating the laptop like the other person in the room and and cutting it like it was. They were there. And letting the text be on the screen has become more of a normal thing in a lot of the language. It's sort of like when cinema finally decided to do the split screen and show two people on a telephone line on either side. That didn't exist forever for a long time. And now it's the same thing with texting. It's so a part of our connectivity and the majority of our day. There had to be a cinematic way to embrace that and feel relatable for all of us. So it was always looking for things that just made the other person at the other end of the conversation seem like they were there, even though they weren't, because that's how we're living so much.
Mm.
Yeah. And Colby, I was interested in the way that you wrote the earliest time storyline, the
Mhm.
Neanderthal storyline, because obviously the language that we're seeing on screen, we're not even seeing it subtitled. And so how did you approach the way that you were writing it, thinking about how much is going to be conveyed by emotion and action on screen? Yes, the language, we can kind of hear and feel the intent, but we don't need to necessarily know the specific words.
When I wrote the script, I wrote everything that they're saying to one another, but I also knew that I didn't want us to hear it or understand it. I wanted us to sort of live on the characters' faces and just sort of get to emote with them, and it felt important to me that we could connect as people, but not totally understand what was going on. And so I had written in everything they said, hoping that they could just emote it all, and we'd find incredible actors and directors to make that work. But what a leap to take on the page! And then we did. We found Andrew and our actors, and they could pull it off.
And how
It's
about for you,
it's
Andrew? Sorry.
Well, that's a lot of people associate the sci-fi side of this storyline with my Wally experience, but my Wally experience all came to the caveman Neanderthal storyline because that was my experience on Wally, was how to convey a lot with very little other than visual and dialogue that you didn't understand. And so I knew you could do it. I just knew it was just about how well it was staged and how well it was performed. But we're so used to staring at faces and studying what people think and having made conclusions before they've even opened their mouth.
Hmm.
So I wasn't too worried.
No, I love what you just described there as well about, in terms of your experience on Wally, because you've talked before about how extensively all of your experience at Pixar has kind of taught you to think very much about human behavior and emotions over necessarily the specific words that a character is saying on screen. And, obviously that's so prevalent in the Neanderthal storyline that like you were just describing, but how did that also infiltrate into the other stories for you?
Well, um, I'm always, no matter whether it's animated or live action, I'm always looking for the behavior and the body language telling you the bulk of everything. Because I was trained that if the sound goes off, do you still understand what's happening? And a lot of the times you can hold 90%, sometimes 100% of what's going on through just behavior and action and the motion of the camera and stuff like that. So it was just came to full play on any of the storylines.
And Colby, for you as a writer, there's a clear intent of the tone wanting to have this hopefulness and this optimism. And, even when things feel difficult, or even when we're facing the concept of our own mortality, that there's still kind of a positive outlook on what that potentially means, not just for us, but kind of larger humanity and community around us. And how was that something that was very prevalent to you throughout the process to make sure you were instilling that?
I think I started writing a film about time without realizing that I was doing this as a way to sort of quell existential anxiety. I think getting to talk about the way that what we do today can sort of carry forward into the future and have an impact that we can't predict or understand or even really imagine today was always sort of the goal for me. And I think that comes across as hopeful, if only because I want to be hopeful. I think we can all vacillate between we're doomed and, oh, maybe we'll figure it out. And I wanted to at least lean slightly towards the, I think we can figure it out if we keep plodding along.
And in writing the script, you're also completely eschewing a traditional 3-act structure and, kind of
Mhm.
going more with like the triptych formation.
Mm.
And within that, I wanted to ask about the way in which you would kind of break apart each of the individual stories and kind of like
Mhm.
look at them as their own entities, but then also look narratively at what are the connective moments, what are the similar heartbeats that they each share with each other.
Yeah, I knew I was not going to structure a film traditionally when I first started. I knew that talking about something that would span tens of thousands of years just didn't make sense to try to tell a hero's journey. And as much as I love sitting down and watching a good guy defeat bad guys, it's not the most interesting way to tell a story to me. So I wanted to try to build something that worked differently, and I initially sat down and sort of wrote out, here's everything that could happen with the Neanderthal family, and here's everything that could happen with a couple first meeting, and here's everything that could happen in the future. And that became a lot of material, and probably 500 note cards that were color coded, and then I could move them around and pull them out and put them back in, and sort of slowly whittle down to something where it felt like the stories were, if not directly pushing each other along, at least rhyming with one another in a way where we felt like each was sort of asking questions that the others might also have answers to.
And we
Absolutely.
never stopped. We never stopped. When we were in live action, while we were shooting on set, we would look for any opportunities of connectivity. We did it in
Mhm.
edit for another 6 months. And even when with the scoring, we would let music cues last under other elements of the story, just finding anything to make it feel unified.
No, and you mentioned that the editing was a huge part of that process, and I've heard Molly Goldstein talk about the way that it was important to edit each of the stories in its own entirety, and then kind of look at how they
Yeah.
coalesce and piece together. And I was just curious what that looked like in terms of how that really helped you to find some touch points that you might not have anticipated before that.
Well, it what it did is it gave you a full understanding of what happened and what's inferred. And then it basically it allowed you to, in another way to put it, is to read the full paragraph of somebody's life and then look at it objectively after that settled in and go, how much of that do I need to understand their life? So
Hmm.
that you could understand the far extreme of how little do I have to tell. And then but even then, it wasn't a how-to. It was just that was sort of it's almost like getting to know somebody and like, and now you know how to caricature them. You know the key elements about once you know them, and as long as those survive, you have a lot of room to play and shove things and move things around and have the confidence that the essence of that story is still going to survive.
No, definitely. And Colby, kind of going back to some of the science fiction elements that you were talking about earlier, that obviously really comes into play in the futuristic storyline with Kate McKinnon's character Coakley, where she's in this space where it's her and, an AI computer system, Roscoe. And how did you really want a lot of the conversations and the relationship between them to talk about the idea of human connection, but what happens when you don't have any other humans around? And, even just going into the facet of the two of them both being willing to sacrifice themselves for something bigger.
When I first started writing the film, I knew I wanted Coakley to have somebody to talk to. But when you start to sort of reckon with the science of space exploration, you can't talk to anybody who's not with you. It really quickly becomes impossible. And so the idea of giving her a companion who was able to communicate with her and support her, but not physically there, sort of meant this sort of perfect combination of the two things, right? She's all alone, and yet she's not completely alone. And so I think that was sort of the impetus for, oh, we could give her a companion that's not human, but would be there to help her out. And then, I was envisioning, I think we've talked about it during making the movie of, we we as humans sort of keep inventing things. We keep inventing fire and then burning ourselves on the fire. And then we have to figure out, wait, how do I actually use this in a way that is safe and useful and not destructive? And so I think sort of envisioning a future in which some of those problems have already happened and we've started to try to correct them was also sort of the goal for that future storyline.
And for you, Andrew, in directing that storyline as well, how did you kind of create the visual landscape of it? Because you want to have it kind of speak to these futuristic elements, but also to feel very connected and familiar to audiences, and also to have a warmth because it's the idea of creating new
Yeah.
faces.
I mean, we all know that there's HAL 2001, but like I loved the challenge of what if it was something you could trust and it was more like what a pet is for you now, in that you put a lot of emotion and connectivity to it, and it really does make you feel fulfilled when you're technically alone in a room. And so I saw Roscoe like this AI, I mean like this sprite, and that this little light that could just show up on your shoulder almost, metaphorically, wherever you were, and almost like a daemon in the Philip Pullman novel or something. And I thought that would be more friendly and more inviting and an optimistic view of how you could have companionship in the far, far future.
And in writing it as well, Colby, what led to the initiation of the idea of what if someone was able to be kind of genetically slowed down for the
Mm.
purpose of humanity?
I knew that the movie was about time and how little we have, and I didn't really know what that meant when I started. But as I kept going, I realized, oh, that is sort of the antagonist of all these stories. A little bit is, wait, we our clock is limited, and so I was intrigued by the idea of, well, what if we solve that? Then what does it mean to be human?
Mhm.
Because to me, it feels like the thing that makes us human is that clock is ticking.
Yeah. And Andrew, in talking about the costumes a little bit as well, you've kind of used them to express different individual relationships and connections. So like we see Rashida Jones at one point in kind of like a turquoisey green, and it's the same color that her adult son is wearing. And so, it shows a lot about their relationship and kinetic. But then you also have kind of the separate individual looks of each of these different storylines being so distinct. And so I was just
Mhm.
interested in how you set about creating all of that.
Well, that was really our costume designer, Miriam Kazar, like did she was always thinking like that. And so we had that's half the fun of pre-production is you can look at it holistically for a while before the clock is suddenly running and you're shooting. And we had time to just pivot when we found one costume for one category and one storyline, and then see a similar thing. We weren't trying to. We were trying to just, in the same way that in editing we just made honestly what was working for that story, but then you could find connections, and it was a little bit like jazz, and you could just kind of make and take advantage of all those things. And we were doing that on every level.
No, I really love that. And lastly, for you, Colby, there's a physical object that also connects all three of the stories. This kind of like acorn piece from the Neanderthal story that carries through. How did you come up with the idea of wanting this physical object that you wanted to carry through all three of them?
I wrote a version of the film where the stories never really connect, and it just didn't feel like it achieved what I wanted the script to achieve, which was sort of this idea of what we do today can move with us into the future, and that can move into the future. And so I was thinking about trying to find a way to do that. And I grew up under my bedroom as a child was under a big oak tree, and it was probably 300 years old. And there was something about being a kid and looking up at this thing that was huge and had always been there and would always be there, that felt like this sort of exploration of time in a way that I couldn't wrap my head around. And so I think the idea of growth and seeds sort of presented itself as this way to talk about time passing and story accumulating without us really being able to, in our short little lives, really understand the full ramifications of that.
And
I
I
love
love that so much that when we connected on the script, we just really pressed it and really made sure it was a spine through the movie, because I thought it was such a strong idea he had.
no, and I love the detail of where it comes from. Well, congratulations on the movie to both of you, and thank you so much for talking about it so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mara.